Today on This Week in Space, we're joined by best-selling author Daniel Suarez to discuss his exciting new book release, Critical Mass. Stay with us.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 47, recorded on February 3rd, 2023. Critical Mass with author Daniel Suarez. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the Critical Mass edition. I'm Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra Magazine, and I'm here with the ineluctable Tariq Malik, editor-in-chief at space.com. Hiya, Tariq.
I'm doing all right. You know, I really need to get a dictionary because a lot of these words I just do not know, Rod, but I'm going to take it as a compliment, and I'm doing great. Great to be
This
here.
one actually is a compliment. Last week's wasn't really, but this one is. And we have the good fortune to be joined today by the Lord Master of the Future New Space Activity, which is also called science fiction, best-selling author Daniel Suarez. Hello, Daniel.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming, and congratulations on the release of Critical Mass.
Oh, I appreciate it.
That's it's an incredible book, and that's what we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. But before we get there, I'm sorry to say we have a new space joke, although this one's actually not too bad, from listener Jonathan Waltz. Are you gentlemen ready?
I'm ready. I'm always ready. Jonathan, lay it on me. So.
Live like a meteor. Try to leave a mark on the world, even if you're burned out. Or, as I was thinking, maybe we should say, live like a meteor, try to have an impact. But anyway, there we go. So it's more of a pun, I guess. As always, we invite you to join Team Tariq and send us your best or worst space jokes. Thanks again to Jonathan for that one. And don't forget to do us a solid and make sure to like, subscribe, and all that cool podcast stuff, because we love you and we want you to show that you love us. All right, let's get on to some headlines.
Yes.
Our first one, you are healed, from space.com. Looks like we had a little instrumentation glitch on the James Webb Space Telescope, but it has recovered, so that makes 2 for 2. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You know, in our last episode, I think it was, we talked about this Canadian-built instrument, I think I'm going to pronounce it wrong, NIRIS, the Near Infrared Imager and Slitless Spectrograph, pardon me. That's a mouthful. I'm just going to call it NIRIS. And they had a communications delay, NASA did, with the instrument itself that really kind of caused it to go out of whack. Sounds like the instrument was fine. They just had to get this delay rectified. And once they got that set, they can kind of get everything back into shape. But while it was being troubleshooted, it did mean that the observations for the telescope were delayed for a bit because parts of this instrument are used in different types of observations. It's got 4 different modes. But you are right. This is the second kind of glitch that has stalled operations in the past, I guess, year and a half. It's been since a year and a month. It's been since it launched into space, and so they're going to take it as a win and learn from it. And, I think they're still worried about micrometeoroids smacking the mirror a little bit more than these glitches that they've been able to get through. So,
now, is this by any chance a bit flip from a cosmic ray or something, or was it just a programming error?
It does seem more on the programming side right now because of the delay part of it, that they traced it down to this delay on the communication side with the instrument rather than the actual instrument itself.
So, Daniel, I'm sure you've been tracking the web and its work.
Oh, my gosh.
Does this,
when it launched, what was it? Christmas Day, I think.
Christmas, that's right.
That was like the best gift ever. So many single points of failure. It was a thriller moment. It really was. And every single one, as they ticked off step after step, I was just like, oh, yes, please, please, please. Because, I mean, what an incredible thing. Hubble, of course, has been amazing.
Yeah.
But to have, 100 times the resolution? It's
roughly 21 feet in diameter as opposed to Hubble's 8.
Mm-hmm.
An imperial unit. So, yeah, quite something. And you see, it was interesting because when it flew, and we did an episode on it as well, you see all kinds of different numbers because everybody loves to throw out numbers. The press loves numbers, your top 10 failure modes for.
That's right.
Jay West and so forth. But in this case, the one that got me that I saw the most common was 470 separate mechanical and electronic events that had to occur for that thing to work
perfectly.
All of them only tested in 1G. And as I related before, they have had times in the past, they being JPL and the community that builds these things, issues with things that were tested in 1G and work great, and then they go out in space and it goes, nah.
Yep.
As early as Mariner 4.
Yeah. And especially after the shake and bake of launch, you've got all that, rattle it a bit, give it some G's on the acceleration out, and it's more fragile than a Swiss clock. Although I don't want to rag on Swiss clock, but
it's 1 million miles away.
So. 1.5 million, I think. Yeah. And what's amazing about that is I'm going to knock wood as I say this, but it worked perfectly. And then when those first images came in, I was just like, oh, fantastic. And thinking of the years of images that we're going to have continuing to come in, I'm very excited about that. Because again, I think it helps to focus people on, yes, we are, the entire universe is out there. It is more incredible than we can easily imagine. And that's one of the gifts that it gives. Hubble gave that, and I think James Webb is going to do that in space.
Well, I'll knock Particle Board to wish them luck, because I don't think I've sold as many books yet as you have.
That's right. I'm not terribly superstitious, but why take a chance?
Yeah.
And I should have a correction just really quick, because I said that the communication delay was on like the communication side with the ground, and that was, I misread my notes. It was actually inside the instrument itself, and it caused a software timeout there, Rod. Just because I know there are eagle-eared listeners out there, and they're going to call me on that.
Eagle-eared.
So I just
eagle-eared. Do eagles have good ears? I don't know.
They just have little holes in the side of their head, last I checked. All right, let's move on. SpaceX hits 200 from space.com. We just had our 200th Falcon 9 launch in a decade, which is... It's mind-numbing. When you count what the launch cadence was like as late as 2012, this is just blowing me away. And it's showing a number of things. It's showing that we can still compete with China, because there are a lot of people, especially in Congress, concerned about that. It's showing that SpaceX got the model right for iteration and evolution of its rocket and reuse. And let's not forget, prior to this, when our launch rate was much lower, we launched rockets and threw everything away except for the shuttle, which brought back the orbiter and the solids, but the solid boosters. But when you're talking about the other rockets, especially just revenue flights to launch satellites and so forth, you just tossed them. So not only has SpaceX upped the ante by a factor of, I'm not sure how many, it's at least triple what it was back in the aughts, the 2000 aughts. It also brings the rockets home and reuses them over and over and over. And the last record I saw was 15 times. What do you know, Tariq?
Yeah. So this was yet another Starlink launch for people who maybe haven't been watching. We used to get excited for any rocket launch, and now we're like, oh, it's another Starlink launch. So, and there's another one. There's another SpaceX launch coming up actually in a few days after we record this too. So they're not stopping. And this was just their latest Starlink launch of the year. It was, I think, the 8th flight. Is that right?
Tariq, one of the things that's interesting about that is you take a look at the pace of the first 100 launches, and then you compare it to the second 100. The second 100 happens so much quicker than that first 100.
I feel like we're spoiled for choice, because usually it's like, oh, there's a launch every week. Sometimes there's a launch twice a week. There's going to be 3 launches in a week.
You're going to need traffic control.
And this one was from Vandenberg Space Force Base. They launched 49 Starlink satellites and one Italian D-orbit, kind of like a space tug that has its own little satellite. So there's a solar sail on it, or there's a sail decelerator, on it, and a few other experiments that are all riding, and they're going to be released in time on their own. But it was that pace that really is the thing to call out, because it was a morning launch from Vandenberg, and it went off spectacularly. The images are amazing, but it's hitting that number 200 that SpaceX is super excited about, and they have at Vandenberg, and I've seen the building in Cape Canaveral that they have off the side on the way out to the port, where they store the boosters from all of these, because they have a lot of them, and the reflight rate, I mean, they've been pushing it. Elon Musk said when they rolled out the current block of the Falcon 9 rocket, Block 5, that maybe they'll fly it 10 times. That was like the goal. And now they're on 15, and they're looking to push that even more. And he had hoped as a stretch, right, that they could get 1 to 100. That's it seemed outlandish at the front, but now they're almost a fifth of the way there with on several boosters. I think at least 3 of them now. And so we'll have to wait and see. They're going to push these really old ones on the SpaceX launches primarily with Starlink.
Because they're not building the F9s anymore, are they? They're really all in on Starship.
They're really pushing on Starship. In fact, they want to start launching the Starlink V2s, which are a little bit bigger, on Starship. And
can you say version 2?
Oh, sorry, version 2.
Felt a little weird for a second there. I went, wait, what?
So that's a whole other thing. The V2 is a whole other thing. Yeah, the version 2.
Oh my gosh, I get your point, Rod. That does, out of context, that sounds very bad.
Yeah.
They want to launch those like on like mega batches on Starlink or on Starship once they get that up and running. And we might be talking about a Starship orbital flight in the next month. We don't know. We're still waiting on the words for that. So big milestones, because if they hit 15 plus 200 flights with Falcon 9, that means that those are going to keep going. They've got Falcon Heavy kind of going on. They've got Starship that they're going to fly to the moon, and they've sold multiple flights to the moon, private ones, as well. So, this is a record that they've set for themselves. They're going to break it, obviously, with the next launch this coming weekend, and then we'll see where 300 is in the next few years, if it's going to take half as long to get there.
Yeah.
So you say they've sold multiple lunar flights. So they've sold out the one to the Japanese businessman, and then I think they've sold a couple of seats on the next one, right?
A couple of seats on the next one, but that's the whole second flight. That's multiple flights around.
That's
around
true.
The moon.
So that's part of the second flight.
Plus at least 2 flights to the moon for NASA.
Because we're here and because we're talking about this, and because I had Daniel as a witness, I'm going to bet you that first orbital test flight is after March 1.
So
I'll bet you my green screen.
That's a very safe bet, I think.
For your piece of wacko art, which is over your left shoulder.
My Barnes and Noble cast off right there.
Yeah.
How many dozen engines are there on it? Because it's 33. The full stack, right?
Yeah, it's 33 on the booster and 6 or 9 on the.
And what have they had, 4 or so? I mean, they've done static fires.
Well, they haven't actually. I don't think they've done a full static fire of the heavy booster, have they? Tariq?
Yeah, after March is a good bet.
Yeah, so they haven't yet. So if you're gonna go for March 1 or after, does that mean that if I pick a later date, then I can't pick anything later than March?
You have to pick a date between now and March 1st.
Well,
because I want to win. I mean, come on. I didn't say it was fair.
All right. I will say the week of the 25th of February. Well, that's a weekend. That's a Saturday.
Wow, so, you're actually going to pick a week.
So like whatever that Monday. What is it? I'm going to say. I got to look at calendar now. Right? All right. So between the 19th and the 28th. All right. That's what I'm going to say. The 19th and 20th. Now that's really optimistic. I really don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to do the 33 engine static fire, and it's going to blow a gasket, and it's going to delay everything. But Rod, in a nod to sportsmanship, I will say yes. That's what I'm going to say right now.
What, you're almost an astronaut. You just never cease to amaze me. All right. So if it launches in that, what's that, a 10-day spread?
Mm-hmm.
I will also send you a free signed copy of Space 2.0.
Oh, all right. I will take that. I will send you my Mars bottle of wine from National Geographic. How about that?
Okay, I think Daniel's melting over there with our bad wit. So let's move on.
No, what I'm thinking is that this guessing on dates in the same sentence as SpaceX is probably
foolhardy,
very speculative.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, they're making great progress, but again, there's so many moving pieces. Well, not even moving pieces yet, but better that they be a little cautious rather than the whole stack. Have a unscheduled disassembly, that type of thing. So,
but a voice whispered in my ear recently that Elon listens to our show, so we just want to put on the pressure. Now that voice,
I'm sure he'll feel the pressure.
That voice is one I often hear, when I'm doing laundry and washing the car, and it tells me, society hates you. Do something about it. But it is a voice, and it tells me that Elon listens to the show. All right, enough of that. Yes. Thank you very much, Tariq. Let's move along. Daniel.
Yes.
It is wonderful having you here. I really enjoyed the book.
Oh, I'm so glad.
You actually sent me a electronic copy and hard copy. So now I've got one to put on the shelf because I lost most of my book inventory about 5 years ago in a rainstorm in storage.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
I'm happy to build it back up, and yours is quite a value for the money because it takes up almost 2 inches on my shelf. So
that was
quite
the goal.
a tome. Yeah. Look, I want to make this profound. So, but before we get into that, and we'll talk about both the titles in that series and whatever else you'd like to, can you just give us kind of a sense of your origin story? Because we're seeing a crop of a new wave of science fiction authors, this is kind of a loose assessment, but coming out of the computer and software and IT industries, where you have to be really smart to work anyway. So maybe the progression to sci-fi is natural, both by virtue of the way people in that trade grow up and how they think and what they learn. I don't know, but I find it remarkable when I look at your work and Andy Weir's work and others, how much of a natural talent you seem to have for moving into this. And I don't know if there's a correlation there or not.
Well, I definitely think there's a connection to tech and sci-fi. Obviously, I think it's because tech powers modern civilization, just about every corner of it. And that would be true in terms of rockets and space as well. And software enables so much. But my start, I'd say I got started really as a full-time author in 2008. And I first started writing cyber thrillers, and I wanted to expand from there because, again, technology, whenever a new technology arrives, it affects society. It either centralizes or decentralizes power. And that's what really fascinated me. So I would examine all sorts of subjects: genetic editing, robotic weapons, like I said, cyber war, and space. For at least the last decade has really interested me. Actually, all of my life, it's interested me, from when I read Cosmos, Carl Sagan's Cosmos as a young person, watched the documentary, read Gerard K. O'Neill's High Frontier. All of that fascinated me. And I was just convinced that by now we would have 1 million people in space. We'd have the beginning of O'Neill cylinders, or at least Bernal spheres. And all of that fascinated me. And then when I started thinking about aspects that are that present existential risks to humanity, like climate change, I started connecting space to that, thinking really getting extra resources and energy could really help solve this problem. I mean, we are within this finite sphere. If we can add those things, bring clean energy to bear, economic development, that always interested me. And what happened was I started thinking, but how would we actually do it? And so that's why I say I've been thinking about this for quite a few years now. And it eventually started to form as a story. Fortunately, my first book, Damon, came out, and that became a New York Times bestseller. That gave me access to some experts. So when I contact a physicist or a scientist somewhere, they won't just ignore my email, thankfully. They'll respond to me and answer my very strange questions. And I kept doing that for a number of years to try to get an answer to the question of, if we're going to do this, exactly how could we do it? Not the way, but one way that it could occur. So that's how I utilized my, let's say, tech-oriented background. I tried to marshal all of these various technologies. And you could probably notice from the book that it includes quite a few different things, not just aerospace, but blockchain and politics and economics and so on. It's quite a bit.
Yeah, and that's a great kind of segue, Daniel. To critical mass. Out now, and it's the second the follow up to Delta V.
It is, and I should probably just summarize it or give a synopsis of the story so they
absolutely.
I was gonna ask if you can kind of give our listeners sort of like the capsule setup. Because it was really exciting coming into it. So, well,
I'll give the quick one. Critical Mass is set in the late 2030s, and it's where the survivors of the first commercial asteroid mining expedition have returned to Earth. And they need to utilize the resources they've placed in lunar orbit to mount a rescue for a couple of people that they left behind at the asteroid. And the issue is that a new Cold War has started in deep space on Earth between China and the US. And they are very interested in those resources as well, as are a few billionaires. So that's the conflict and the competition of the story. It is the second book in a planned trilogy. The first book, Delta V, takes place and details the asteroid mining expedition itself, and that goes to the asteroid Ryugu. So that is a synopsis of the story. And again, I wanted to tell the story starting from where we are in the present, essentially, and start to go step by step on how we become a celestial civilization eventually.
And was there any particular reason why you chose Ryugu?
I did. I chose it because I did quite a bit of research on asteroids. I wanted it to be a near-Earth asteroid, not one out in the asteroid belt, because of course, beyond Mars, that's just going to be a way too far for an initial step. And as I started, there was a tool. It still exists. It was NASA Ames, I believe, but Cyrus Foster wrote it. It was the trajectory browser. And basically what you can do is you can examine hundreds of thousands of objects, and you can take a look at trajectories. And what I was looking for was a very low delta V trajectory. And one of the things that became clear pretty soon in my research was that there's almost keyhole moments with asteroids that you'll have these really, NHATS, by the way, is another tool you can use for this, another NASA tool. You can see these very big delta Vs until there's just a little tiny window where it will suddenly plunge. And in the case of Ryugu, this is an asteroid that occasionally gets very close to Earth. It has very low delta Vs. As a matter of fact, the December 13th, 2032 trajectory, I believe, is less than the delta V that would be required to reach the surface of the moon. And so that was a great deal of interest to me. I think it was a 28-day transfer. Ryugu is 450 million tons. It's nitrogen, ammonia, all of these really useful materials. And so that was the best candidate of all the, thousands and thousands that I examined. I was really detailed in my research on it.
That much was clear. I was going to say, I recently read a book by an emerging author. So I get Kindle Unlimited, so I get a lot of emerging sci-fi authors. And I read a book that was really wonderfully written. Characters were great. Story was great. Pacing was great. But the guy kept talking about, and the moon, which is millions of miles away. And I said,
that'll throw you right out of it.
It does. It pushes you right out of the room. And now you're angry. And you clearly done your homework. And I have to say, Critical Mass, and I'm not going to go back and read Delta V, but Critical Mass reads almost like it was plucked from 2070,
Wonderful. That's great to hear.
And it reads like a history. And so the magazine, I published this for the National Space Society, which has been around since, I think, 76.
And that came out of the L5 Society, correct?
No, it was actually separate. It was the National Space Institute that Werner von Braun started with another person.
Okay.
And then they merged with the L5 Society, which was the, you're probably familiar with through the whole O'Neill movement.
Absolutely.
And became this kind of combination of the two. But they have a book, which I update every few years, called The Roadmap to Space Settlement. And it's not a Delta V read or a Critical Mass read. It's a pretty dry document. But I swear, I was reading your book and I thought, this is like almost lockstep with this roadmap we've got. So it's like a history of the future, Well,
that's part of the goal. I wanted it to be scientifically and technically rigorous so that somebody who is an expert in these industries can read it. And that suspension of disbelief can still occur for them.
Right.
They can enjoy that story. I don't want to throw them out of it. I really wanted to go the extra mile to make it correct, partly because when it comes to mainstream audiences, and if I have a brand in my fiction, it is this. I try to take nuanced technological and scientific issues that I think are really relevant to mainstream people, although they might not know what's going on or how it might affect them. And I try to make it accessible through fiction. I try to make them feel something about these things. And that was true of, killer robotics and genetic editing, all of that stuff. But when it comes to space, so often I'll talk to mainstream people about space who may not follow it, and they will immediately bring up, hey, we have pressing issues here on Earth. I think that's more important. And what I really like people to understand, rather than just make an argument or just say it, I'd like to demonstrate, show how space is going to be absolutely critical in solving a lot of the problems here on Earth, especially the pressing ones of climate change, economic development, even of us learning to work together as a species across borders, thinking globally.
Well, so that question, as you know, because I think you might just be barely old enough to remember Apollo, that objection has come up since they were preparing for the first tests of the Saturn V.
Yes.
Why are you spending that money in space? We have potholes on Main Street and hungry children.
But remember the conflict that was going on at the time. And by the way, you're right. I was woken up in the middle of the night by my father, and I just barely remember it. But I'm so glad he did get me up. It was 5 or something. But the conflict that was going on in the civil strife in society. So it was both, in many ways, the best of us and the worst of us at once. And I sort of felt that way about James Webb in a way. The tumult going on in the world when that was going up. And there was just this moment of, we are capable of just sublime things as a species. I mean, just the incredible fact that $11 billion was spent over, 15 years to build this incredible machine and place it out there so that we could perceive the cosmos with more clarity and understand the universe, and then share that to everyone. And my God, what a magical thing. And then you also read the rest of the news. so we're really an interesting species, is what I could say. But I love the fact that we are capable of these things. And I'd love more people to focus on that and think, we can really, part of it is I want to shift the Overton window. That is this frame of acceptable conversation, so people can start to think, hey, going to space is not just a hobby of billionaires. I think it's going to be critical. It's going to be critical for industry and for culture and for energy, so many things.
I had meant to ask this question a bit later, but I think where we're going now, it's a good time. And it is about climate change, because it is a natural enemy in critical mass, in the world of Delta V2. And just the sheer amount of technology that has that crossover effect, so it's being used in space, for this one goal. But there is this applicable use that's pure spin-off, right? That NASA releases a report, every year, but we're seeing a lot of that now too. I mean, like right now, as we're talking, there's this horrible windstorm going on outside, and it's the temperature's plummeting. And I'm glad to be nice and toasty in here, but I'm curious, from the research that you had done, what space technologies beyond just Earth observation that we see now, because that's when people think about climate change research that NASA does, it's just looking at the Earth and tracking everything, maybe helping with disaster response, that sort of thing. What can we physically actually do, to get closer to that critical mass universe, to start taking some substantial impacts rather than just kind of watching it happen and reacting to it?
So this is one of the many challenges that I for some reason took up in these books. But in Critical Mass, I did an examination, or I depicted this effort to, let's say, correct the atmosphere to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And this was presented as a conceptual idea, a debate that people were having. Do we even have the ability to actually affect the climate at the global level, or at least the composition of the CO2 in the atmosphere? And what would that take? What I thought was fascinating. Now, let me start this by saying that recently the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact, they had taken some of the IPCC data, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and started to put it together into scenarios. I think the Washington Post did a cover story on this. So if people want to take a look, they could Google that and find it. And they had 1,200 scenarios for how we could try to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what I thought was interesting is, as they examined this, 1,000 of these scenarios were already too late. We couldn't do them. So you had 200, and they progressively went through what it's going to take to try to constrain global warming. And what they found was, many of the ones that remained, there were going to be a couple of decades where we're going to be above 2 degrees, even, and maybe coming back. So I started thinking, none of these, by the way, take into account something like solar power from space. Being able to beam terawatts of energy around to the various spots on Earth to try to power CO2 extraction machines, like the ones you see from Climeworks up in Iceland. Because that's always the question, is if you need a 1.5 megawatts to run each one of these things to pull, let's say, a million metric tons of CO2 out of the air every year from each, how much would it take? How much would it cost? And believe it or not, I searched everywhere, and you couldn't easily find a single source that says, this is how much we're going to have to pull out of the air. This is how much it's going to cost. This is how many machines it's going to take. And right now, we're increasing the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere by about 2 each year. And that's with us. So, we're slowing the growth of the release of CO2. And I think there's a prevailing view that, well, we're getting a handle on it. And really, the truth is, we're just slowing the growth of it. We're not reversing it. And even if we were to stop emissions right now, we would continue to grow warmer each year. There's a bit of a surplus each year in thermal energy. So I wanted to examine in this story, one of the many things, I wanted to fictionalize it and make it interesting, but have the characters ask that question of, how can we actually fix this? Is it even possible? And that's why I bedeviled several experts for quite a while. And I am happy to say that I really do think we can. And more than that, I think we can create many, many jobs while doing it and increase global cooperation. Basically, this is a challenge that I think we can do together that will increase trust and also present many opportunities.
That's your answer right there, Rod. About
well, that's a bunch of answers.
That's my short answer too.
I was going to say
about why
think,
space.
I think one of the experts that you bedeviled, quote unquote, for probably a fair amount of time was somebody I work with a lot as well, John Mankins.
Yes,
about space solar power.
He was very kind.
Yeah,
very patient,
and has the most awesome eyebrows in existence anywhere. Clearly. Which I give him gas about every time I see him, but truly one of the leading thinkers in the world about space solar power. And it's interesting, space solar power, as I'm sure you looked up, has a trajectory of, more or less as an advanced concept, at least invented in the United States. And then, as we so often do, we said, oh, that's interesting. Let's go concentrate on something else now. Japan picked up the mantle. Then China said, hey, this is a pretty good idea for some of the problems we have with resources. And now, of course, Europe's jumping in. And as so often happens, now that we see overseas potential competitors joining the race, we're going, oh, this is a cool idea. Where'd it come from? Oh, we did it. Okay. So I guess my question for you is twofold. So there's space solar power, and also very prominent in your story is rotating habitats to create artificial gravity. And I think possibly from your exposure to O'Neill at an early age, the idea is we can build these things with material from the moon and or asteroids that's launched by mass drivers and so forth. So feel free to riff on that a bit if you like. But what I guess I'm really wondering is, as so many of us thought when we read O'Neill and other books, when the heck see this begin to happen, even in a pilot project?
Yeah. Well, that's what it comes down to, is I wanted to impart a sense of urgency and then also remind people that what O'Neill was talking about was a mass driver on the moon back then. Again, we don't have to launch millions of tons out of Earth's gravity well into space. And again, if you're using methalox, what sort of damage would thousands and thousands of launches do in the upper atmosphere, releasing that? It would be really detrimental, but it's also not necessary. I think if we establish operations on the moon, near Earth asteroids, and start to bring hundreds of thousands and millions of tons of mass operating material, we can really start to build these things, particularly with robotics. It is remarkable, right here in my hometown of Pasadena, how many companies are here actually prototyping and doing these things now. So I think big pieces of this, as you mentioned, Gerard K. O'Neill and O'Neill Colony's mass drivers, many of these things have been technologically possible for decades. Numerous decades. There just has not been the impetus and the public will to do it, or the connecting tissue that allows people to see how this relates to their current pressing problems. So that's part of what I'm trying to do with this. And the other part, when you mentioned solar power from space, the immediate reaction I get from many people, and again, let's say uninitiated people have heard of it. The first thing is usually death ray. We don't need death rays in space.
I have a question on that.
Sure. We'll come back to it in 2 seconds. I'll say the second part. And so, we're talking really about 100 watts per meter. I think 230 watts per meter. I was going to say there's a test going up, it's SPX 27, I think of March 11th, which is a test platform. I'm paying attention to that. This would be an example platform. I think since we use microwave transmission for cell tower communications and everything, really, we're just moving it into space. I fully anticipate that this will work. We can talk about the conversion factors and all that stuff. But that is one aspect, is solar power as a death ray. And the other thing is that, again, the conversions, it doesn't make sense. It's too expensive. Why would we have this? We have so many pressing problems on Earth. And again, I really want to relate it to people and say, look, if you can bring terawatts of clean energy, that is fairly constant. Because again, if you have a solar power on the planet, on the surface of the planet, let's say on the equator at noon, you're getting at best 1,000 watts per meter. In space, you're getting 1,348 watts per meter, but you don't have sunrise and sunset and cloudy days and various angles of latitude to deal with. So 6-7 times the productivity of a solar panel on the surface. And if you start to beam that anywhere in the hemisphere beneath a geosynchronous satellite, and you have a solar power satellite, you can really make civilization resilient to the disruption that climate change and conflict and many other things can cause. And it's that steady supply of power that will help keep us together and power industry and human activity through this tumultuous period. So that's what I try to get across in this story. But Tariq, you were going to bring up an issue.
Yeah. So I will be asking about solar power, but I'll remind our listeners that if you like what you're hearing, please like and subscribe to the podcast on TWiT so that I can like and subscribe to what Daniel's going to tell me about solar power. Because you were just talking about, it's not a death ray, but I watched Die Another Day, that James Bond film, and where they
always a good source for scientific information.
He is part of the intelligentsia for sure.
Did he windsurf on a wave, a tidal wave in that? I think he did.
Yeah. I think so. And they do turn the power sat into a death ray there, and I think that's the whole plot of Power Sat by Ben Bova way back when. And of course, like right now, we're talking a lot about space weapons at space.com, where they're talking about satellites that can actually fire beams or whatever at other people. And what is the safety kind of discussion there that kind of calms people down? Because it sounds from your description that the energy levels you would need for that kind of a fear mongering thing is not what we're talking about when we're talking about microwave.
I'd love to talk about that. Actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because so many people have misconceptions about what is being proposed. There is a gentleman, unfortunately, I can't remember his name, is a scientist who works in this space. And part of his demonstration, he will put a transmitter that's transmitting the same amount of energy at the same level of density from the back of the room onto him as he's doing the presentation. And he brings up at one point, I am literally in the beam right now. And so it's not going to fry birds. It's not going to do any of that. The idea is you would use a rectenna. And the interesting thing about the rectenna is again, it's more like a netting. So 90+% of sunlight can go through it. So you could actually put this on poles over crops or over grazing area. You could even have solar panels underneath the rectenna. Huh. And because of the wavelength, it will capture almost all of the microwave energy. And I believe the OSHA standard now is 100 watts per meter. It used to be globally 230 watts per meter. And again, you can make it denser, you can make it less dense, but I think it's for 2 gigawatts. If you had a 2 gigawatt solar power satellite, you're talking a rectenna that's about 5 kilometers or so square. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't have to be in one spot. You can bifurcate that beam. You could send it near to different cities. And again, you'd actually be reducing the amount of transmission lines going from where the energy is created to the city. You could bring it closer. Again, it's not a deadly beam. And that's the great thing about space, especially low Earth orbit or geosynchronous orbit. People could actually use optics from Earth to confirm that there's not a huge weapon there. It's in full view of the entire planet. So if somebody starts erecting a death ray, it will become a subject of conversation. And right now, I think if people start developing deadly weapons, it's very difficult to see who's doing that on Earth. But the thing about doing it in orbit, especially if many different nations are in orbit and have a vibrant cislunar economy up there, people could just look over and see the neighbors and say, hey, what are you doing? So it's not something that could be done in secret. And I think the benefits would far outweigh being able to beam that energy and sell it to consumers on Earth who are trying to solve problems. Again, there is so much room. That's such a growth market. I think that's what people would be focused on.
Yeah.
Not so much the death ray, which again, that's fiction.
Yeah. The first thing that jumped to my mind, you were talking about climate change earlier, is being able to just send that power where people need it right away from a storm like Puerto Rico and that horrible hurricane there.
Could you imagine? They
Yeah.
could just, because a Rec 10 is very easy to erect. It is not complex. It is fairly cheap. And if it's damaged, let's say by a mudslide or a fire, it can be quickly repaired or rebuilt. They could unfurl it and receive that power very quickly. I believe the U.S. military is also looking at it for that reason, to be able to power a forward operating base very unobtrusively, but quickly. And remember, this is clean energy. This is not going to affect. The other thing that people bring up is, well, we don't want any more energy being pumped into the atmosphere. Again, this is sunlight that was going to strike the Earth anyway. So you're intercepting the energy and beaming it down and absorbing it by. The other thing I'd like to point out is a coal-fired or natural gas plant. Half of that energy is radiated in the form of heat before it even hits. Before a single watt gets into the grid. So the efficiency of that conversion from microwave to electricity is, I believe, upwards of like 89%, that portion of it. Although I always like to bring this up, yes, the total efficiency from the solar panel in orbit down to conversion where it meets the grid is about 9%. And that always throws people because they say, my God, that's horrible compared to, let's say, 23, 24% efficiency from a solar panel on Earth. But again, I would like to remind people that a solar panel in space, deep space, is 6 to 7 times more productive than one on the surface of the planet. And I think Germany's starting to see that now with a lot of their solar installations. Is their latitude, their cloudy days and stuff, is they're not getting anywhere near the production that, say, Southern California is.
Right. And they have the misfortune of clouds at nighttime.
Yeah.
So, So and it is important, as you've mentioned a couple of times, in that this, once this is launched, or once the technology is positioned on the moon to provision the mass drivers to get the building materials, however we end up doing it, it's clean.
Yes,
it's clean, and it allows
it
the
is
Earth
sustainable
to heal and work back. It's very sustainable.
One thing I'd also like to add is, when it comes to wind turbines and solar, you are going to need battery backups to, because there are certain times when there's wind, the wind blows and the sun is shining, and the times when there isn't. And of course, a Tesla Powerwall or some big infrastructural element, that is an enormous cost, remember. Now, the great thing about beamed energy from space is, again, if you have dozens and dozens of these satellites in orbit, you will always have access to that energy. You will have failover potential. And when you take a look, John Mencken's design, the SPS Alpha, for example, the latest one, it's about 7,400 tons, I think, it's a couple kilometers on a side, but it's this gossamer type thing. It is very big, but if you could get that energy not launched out of Earth's gravity well, but from a near-Earth asteroid or from a lunar mass driver, you could start to automate the production of these. It's not actually a very complicated thing. It's many small components that are repeated, and they can be assembled robotically in space. And then suddenly you've got a bunch of energy that you can beam where you need it.
So I want to pull a quote from your book, and I'm going to paraphrase only the family unfriendly word in it. Space is where BS goes to die. Out there, only facts and competence will keep you alive. Superstition, uneducated guesses, and comforting lies must go extinct. So have you considered running for Congress, perhaps? This was, there are many quotes. I made a lot of notes when I was reading the book, but this one really jumped out and grabbed me by the throat because I thought, this is one of those things. Al Worden, was it Al Worden? I think it was Al Worden years ago. No, sorry.
Pete Worden?
Ed Mitchell.
No,
Ed Mitchell.
Ed Mitchell, okay.
Made a quote about the overview effect where he basically said, and I'll have to paraphrase because salty language, but he basically said, you want to grab a congressman or a politician by the neck, dragged them by the scruff of their neck out to 240,000 miles and say, look at that, USOB, to educate them about the fact that the world is one contiguous set of continents and it's not nation states and all that.
No borders visible up there, that tenuous atmosphere, that little thin envelope, that everything that has ever happened with us is contained within that little envelope, isolated in space. I think it's Frank White with the overview effect.
Yes.
It's really remarkable. I'm glad you picked that quote out. The quote you just mentioned is from Nathan Joyce, who is the billionaire who sets a lot of this in motion.
And excuse me, but I want to thank you for not using some weird, Milan husk or something like that to try and, because you see that in science fiction a lot. And it's like, please, we get it. We're smart. So good job. Good job.
Well, thank you. I would say he is a composite person. Yes. It's many people ask me, it's like, is that Elon Musk? A cursory examination would show that it's not. He is doing things a little differently. But again, billionaires have an outsized impact. I like to think that their imaginations sort of exist outside of their body. They can make things happen. And that's good or bad. It depends on what they're imagining. And, that character, Nathan Joyce's character, who first appears in Delta V, in the first book, he is somebody who is complicated, let's say. That's the best way I could describe him. He has a vision, but he also has real world pressing needs that he's trying to deal with. And that's, I think, us writ large. And what he's trying to get at there is that space can cure us of a lot of our worst habits, in the sense that we indulge ourselves because we have a society that allows a lot of specialization. People don't have to do hunting and gathering every day. So we can engage in a lot of activities that are not particularly helpful or necessary. But one of the things that space would do, especially if we're trying to establish or extend civilization or build a cislunar economy, is space is unforgiving. And right now that may actually help us deal with each other, to cross over those boundaries you're talking about, find commonalities between us. Because one of the people that I spoke to in doing research for this book was somebody who managed a large mining operation at a remote location. And contrary to what I expected, he said that a lot of these companies out there and the people out there, they don't directly compete with each other. Sure, they're nominally competitors, but given their remote location and the life and death risks they were facing, they very much relied on each other. And I thought that was surprising and interesting. And that's on Earth. And you can imagine how that would work out in space. That I like to think of it as what's called a blue ocean market. That is, it's not red ocean. There's not deadly competition just yet. It is so wide open that I think it could foster a lot of cooperation as we try to solve these problems. The upside is so incredible and the downside is so terrible that I think it will bring out the best of us. And that's what I was trying to get at in that quote. And by the way, that quote ends actually with him saying that superstitions and uneducated guesses must go extinct, not us. And it's the not us part, that we have seen, I think it's a total of 24 or 25 civilizations fall apart in all of human history. How can we get to the next level, get a step change in our civilization? If we can move off of the earth, not move in our entirety, but move our heavy industry, carbon producing industry, energy producing industry, it can vastly increase the amount of energy and resources at our disposal, which will solve so many problems. And again, that's clean energy.
I wanted to kind of build on the whole the Nathan Joyces of the world with the fact that we've got these real life billionaires. We've got Elon Musk.
We do.
His private space program. We've got Jeff Bezos and what we may or may not be a big orbital program. They've got a big rocket, but they haven't launched it into orbit yet.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious how optimistic you see them actually reaching their goals, because Elon Musk, SpaceX, they're not talking about building their own factories in space. They're talking about the ships and the transportation, and Jeff Bezos really loves O'Neill habitats, but he's talking about, like some transportation and it's a satellite network for internet, just like SpaceX too. And at the same time, NASA says they're going to get to Mars in the 2030s, which they've been telling us is like it's 20 years away for the last 40 years. And so I'm it feels to me, after 20 years of doing this, that we're closer than ever, but it's still that far out. And I'm curious how on the level you see the current pace with this private industry really pushing, at least on the transportation side.
Yeah.
If we're actually going to get to a destination in deep space by 2033, like NASA or these private companies are saying, or is it going to be even slower going than that right now, despite the pace?
Okay. So I'm going to bring up something that's going to sound like a negative, and it is going to be somewhat of a negative, but it's also a positive. And let me explain.
That's okay.
The challenges facing us, the burning fuses of a couple things. I've already mentioned climate change, but there is also the geopolitical competition between China and the United States. And I would also add economic development. And while we're at it, that geopolitical competition, let's also bring up the Kessler syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Increasingly more countries are coming online that have ASAT or anti-satellite weapons. And any significant conflict that develops between superpowers, probably one of the first things that would happen is they'd try to knock out each other's satellites. And your audience probably does know what the Kessler syndrome is, this idea that you would blow up satellites and that debris would scatter all over low Earth orbit and impact other satellites and create a cascade of debris that eventually envelopes low Earth orbit, making it very difficult, if not impossible, to launch from Earth, possibly for generations. So all of those really serious risks that I just described actually impart a sense of urgency into this. So you were talking about the very slow incremental progress for a long time. And let's go back to the Cold War and the Apollo missions. That was a tremendous amount of progress made so fast. I think it was adjusted for inflation, $220 billion dropped, in no time. And you compare NASA's current budget, I think there might be some salutary effects from this, that it would get us moving quicker. And, we definitely do not want to have conflict in space. That could be really bad. But if we start to accelerate things, then I think we can start the conversation about how to deal with these opportunities and risks. I think we might actually see movement on making big progress in space in the next few years. Reusable rockets will have some to do with that. But again, I keep bringing people back to the fact of in situ resource utilization, trying to get mass drivers in near Earth asteroids. We need not dozens or hundreds of tons, but hundreds of thousands and millions and eventually billions of tons of mass to work with in cislunar space. And I bring this up again and again. I have covered this somewhat in Delta V. Mars colonization, I get a lot of flames for this, but Mars colonization to me is not the very next goal we should be looking at. To me, that if we spend the next 10 years and let's say $500 billion sending a couple dozen people to Mars, I do not think that should be a pressing priority for us. Building a cislunar industry and helping to go out into space to benefit Earth, I think, first of all, engender far less opposition domestically in terms of fiscal priorities. And it will help us work across borders to solve these problems, to bring clean energy to bear, new jobs, again, all of the industries, clean, silicon wafer production, Z-band fiber optics, pharmaceuticals, metallurgy, so many different applications, but you need mass to work with. And so you can imagine that lots of people around the world investing in that, seeing the rewards of it, versus spending a great deal of money to do the Mars colonization. A Mars colony that will be dependent upon Earth, absolutely, for at least the next 100 years or more. Yeah. And so, again, I'm not against, obviously, us going to Mars eventually. I think if we establish a cislunar economy and industry when we do go to Mars, it will be in a big way. We'll be able to have people in orbit around it. As people go down for the first time, it'll be much more safe and reasonable and much more likely to succeed. In the meantime, of course, we could send lots of robots and other things. I use quite a bit of telepresence equipment in this book, again, to deal with radiation and other risks. But I really focus on cislunar as the beginnings of this industry. And that's what I think will accelerate things, both the competition, the and astropolitical competition between China, Russia, and the US for the L points in between the Earth and the Moon. That's, I think, going to be something to watch. And I think countries are going to be incentivized to act quickly to try to solve this. Like I said, that competition is real.
So I've got, I think Tariq does too. We have a lot of questions we'd love to ask, so we'll just simply have to have you back. But I did want to bounce one more quote off you that grabbed me by the throat and made me snicker a bit. People who describe themselves as risk takers, though they seem to confuse themselves with their money. that yes. was brilliant.
Well, that's obviously the perception of somebody, JT, James Ty, the guy who has skin in the game out in space very often. One of them, his view of financial people. And I get the sense that that's shared by a lot of rough and ready space people, which I respect. I mean, somebody who actually puts their life on the line out in space. I mean, that is pretty incredible.
However, kudos to the people that have the financial well-being to be able to power the new space age as well, right? So we need both, and
but you can still be snarky,
being the risk takers, that's fine. Although Elon has never indicated he'll be on any of the first 5 starships to fly. So the burning question, I think, in the minds of a lot of people who are listening to this, probably, which is why I saved it for the ending because I'm clever, is when do we see installment 3 in the series?
Well, I am already working on it. I'm already thinking about it. I'm not sure exactly when. The way these work is I cast a broad net. I know what it is I wanted to do. That's why I set out to write this trilogy to begin with. So, I don't want to give a date. I won't do a SpaceX date and then keep moving.
That's an Elon Musk date. So.
But it also has to fit into some other projects I'm working in. But I will say this: I'm definitely doing it because once again, I set out from the very start to try to do a trilogy that took us from the present and to that future. How do we get there with no hand waving, using technology that we have or that's prototyped right on the drawing board and proven to work? How do we get there? And I wanted to know that I didn't even have an answer when I started this out, whether or not that was even truly possible. But the more experts I talked to, and some of them disagreed with each other, but the more I talked to, the more I realized we can do this. In fact, why aren't we doing it? And so I really wanted to tell a story that first of all, interests and excites readers and pulls them in. And again, mainstream readers, people who are not particularly into every jot and tittle of the science or the technology here. I wanted them to feel something about it. And I guess if I have a brand, it's that. I try to popularize some of these scientific and technological concepts that I think will be really relevant to mainstream everyday people, who may not be paying attention to this. Because I think a lot of people don't realize what we can do already in space, but aren't doing. And I think it's a source of frustration, certainly for space enthusiasts like us. It is incredibly frustrating when I think back to 1980 when I was watching the space shuttle first launch, but then you take a look at some of the designs that Lockheed and others did for reusable rockets back in the 70s. It's just frustrating as hell. It's like, what are we doing? But so trying to make mainstream people and also policymakers, entrepreneurs, all of these people kind of see a big picture they might not have thought of. And again, it's not my picture. It's a picture that I've a mosaic that I've put together from speaking to many, many experts and trying to see how this might fit together. And I think you've probably seen this when you talk to subject matter experts. A lot of these people are so focused on their own field, absolute experts in it, that they don't often have a chance to cast a broad net and see how their work might connect to completely unrelated fields. And I think that's one of the things that an artist can do is walk around and talk to all of these somewhat insular, at times insular scientists and intrude and say, hey, what are you up to? And maybe say, well, this could connect to that. And is what I'm saying crazy if I connect this to that? And if they say, no, that's interesting, then I know I'm onto something. And so I rinse and repeat that. So that's why I can't give you a delivery date for the third book.
Good enough. Yet. And that's a really good point, by the way, about some of the soloing that occurs. I write a book for JPL every year about their technology greatest hits. And, there is not currently a strong program to cross-pollinate there. They're working on it, but it doesn't always happen. And you could be sitting one building away from an office you just left talking about, spherical, inflatable, parabolic antennas to another person who's working on something very similar and say, have you been talking to Dr. So-and-so? No? So I want to thank you, Daniel, once again for joining us today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure.
Is your new
Happy
book.
to come back too, because it seemed like we talked for 5 minutes. It was a very enjoyable conversation.
Zips by, and we really didn't get to talk about the book very much.
Oh, yes.
Talk about the concept.
My publisher will be so thrilled that I
do that.
Yes.
But it is a must read. So please, whether you go to Amazon, go to Vroman's private bookstore in Pasadena, wherever your local Barnes and Noble is, buy this book, read this book. If you want to be carbon conscious, you can buy it for Kindle or Kobo or one of the other readers. It's up to you, but do buy it because it really is a wonderfully optimistic look at a future that you don't often see. So thank you for that, Daniel. And speaking of Daniel, where's the best place to keep up with your ongoing activities?
Well, let's see. I'm on tour right now. So I'll be down in San Diego on February 6th at Mysterious Galaxy Bookstore. I'll be up in Palo Alto on February 8th at Books Inc. And in Phoenix, Arizona, February 17th at the Poison Pen. And in Seattle on February 22nd at the University Bookstore. So I'm really looking forward to meeting my readers.
Well, and kudos to you because book tours generally are a thing of the past. So you clearly earned the fact that you could actually get on an airplane as opposed to sitting and doing 20 radio stations in a morning like I did last time.
I should also point out that I'm going to be on TWiT with Leo, I think, on the 10th. Also.
Yeah, that's a triangulation, right?
Triangulation, yes, which I'm looking forward to. I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to seeing him again. I used to listen to his Tech Guy all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Unbelievable that he's retired. It's like I go turn it on when I'm driving around doing errands, and it's like, oh my God.
And he's only retired from terrestrial broadcast radio. I mean, he's working as hard as ever.
I know.
I mean, this network puts out, 40 hours of programming a week or something. It just blows my mind.
It really
all I
does.
can do to get this pulled together. So kudos to Leo and thank you for them to sending you our direction. Tariq, where do we keep up with your amazing busy life?
Yes, well, always at space.com. You can find me on the Twitters at Tariq J Malik. And the J this week stands for just waiting for SpaceX to pick a date for that 33 engine Starship Super Heavy test, because we do want to see that fire and we got to figure out where we're going to go watch the launch from. So we got to make some plans.
Do I hear a we? Are you taking me with you?
It's the royal we, but hey, yeah, Rod, we should go. Let's go.
Looking at the size of that stack, I'd make sure it's a good distance.
It's the world's biggest rocket.
Yeah.
And we got to go, Rod. We got to go.
I would love to. They used to talk about the Saturn V, if had it a mishap being the power equivalent of a small nuclear warhead. So,
and this is bigger.
Starship.
And it's bigger.
Yes, it's about double that. So there's probably an exponential difference. But yeah, I'll watch it with you from about 7 miles out at sea.
Telepresence. That's what you need.
Oh,
like an Atlas robot. Again.
Yeah. I don't think anybody would want to make a robot out of me. You can always track me at pylebooks.com, my slightly outdated website, or at adastromagazine.com, the magazine of the National Space Society, which I edit and picture edit and write for, and pretty much do everything except cooking the macaroni. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, and occasionally Instagram. Do not forget to drop us a line at twit@twit.tv. That's TWIS at twit.tv. We always welcome your comments, suggestions, and ideas, especially if they're nice, but they don't have to be. And I answer every single email. So don't be shy. We're here for you. New episodes of This Week in Space publish every Friday on your favorite podcatcher and on the TWiT network. So make sure to subscribe, like, and tell your friends. Give us reviews, 5 stars, thumbs up, big kiss on your computer screen, whatever you want to do, we'll take it. And you can head to our website at twit.tv/TWIS. Finally, don't forget, you can get all the great programming on the TWiT network ad-free on Club TWiT, as well as some extras that are only available there. They're kind of a secret unless you join, for just $7 a month. And that's cheaper than, I think, the last Carl's Jr. Cheeseburger I had. Finally, you can follow the TWiT Tech Podcast Network at TWiT on Twitter and on Facebook, and twit.tv on Instagram. It has been a pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you so much, and I'll see the rest of you next week.
Oh, hey, that's a really nice iPhone you have there. you totally picked the right color. Hey, since you do use an iPhone and maybe use an iPad or an Apple Watch or an Apple TV, well, you should check out iOS Today. It's a show that I, Micah Sargent, and my co-host Rosemary Orchard host every Tuesday right here on the TWiT network. It covers all things iOS, tvOS, HomePodOS, watchOS, iPadOS. It's all the OSs that Apple has on offer, and we love to give you tips and tricks about making the most of those devices, checking out great apps and services, and answering your tech questions. I hope you check it out.